London, August 1945. The guns have finally fallen silent. From Trafalgar Square to the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the streets are a roaring ocean of red, white, and blue. A million people are chanting, "We want the King," as Winston Churchill stands on the balcony, flashing the iconic V for victory sign. To the eyes of the world, this is the British Empire at its zenith. This is the moral giant that stood alone against the darkness of fascism. This is the savior of Western civilization. But strip away the confetti, turn off the newsreels, and walk a mile down the road to the dim, unheated corridors of the British Treasury in Whitehall. Here, there is no cheering. There is only a terrifying, suffocating silence. On the mahogany desks of the men who actually ran the empire, the ledger books lay open, and the numbers were screaming a secret that would have silenced the crowds outside. The empire was not just tired, it was terminally insolvent. The vaults were empty. The gold that had backed the pound sterling for a century was gone, shipped across the Atlantic in secret convoys to pay for survival. The overseas investments that fed the British people had been forcefully liquidated. The factories were worn out. The V for victory was a facade. In reality, Britain had just completed the most expensive suicide mission in history. They don't teach you this in history books. They tell you the United States saved Britain. But the financial documents tell a different, darker story. They reveal that, while British soldiers were fighting on the beaches of Normandy, American accountants were executing a hostile takeover in the boardrooms of Washington. Britain didn't just pay for the war with blood. They paid with their sovereignty. They traded their past to save their present, and in doing so, they sold their future to their closest ally. This is not the story of how the empire was saved. This is the story of how it was foreclosed. To understand the anatomy of this foreclosure, we must rewind. We must leave the celebrations of 1945 and descend into the freezing, desperate winter of 1940. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but on the ground, the empire was bleeding out. Coventry was burning. Liverpool was crumbling under the Luftwaffe's hammer. But inside the cabinet war rooms, beneath the streets of London, Winston Churchill was fighting a battle that no Spitfire pilot could help him win. On December 8, 1940, Churchill sat at his desk to write the most dangerous letter of his political career. It was addressed to Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States. History books often portray this letter as a handshake between friends, a noble call for alliance against evil. It was nothing of the sort. It was a confession of insolvency. Churchill, a man who could weaponize the English language, stripped away all rhetoric. He laid the financial corpse of the empire on Roosevelt's desk. He wrote that the moment was rapidly approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the shipping and supplies required to keep fighting. He was telling the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, was broke. Why was the wealthiest empire in history penniless after only a year of fighting? Because of a ruthless American policy, known innocuously as cash and carry. When the war began in 1939, the United States was officially neutral. American industrialists smelled opportunity, but the American public wanted no part of European slaughter. So, Congress passed a compromise. It stated that belligerent nations could buy American weapons, steel, and oil, but there would be no loans, no credit, and no American ships risking their hulls. The terms were brutal. You want our steel? You send your own ships and you put gold on the barrelhead before the crates leave the New York docks. This was not aid. This was a checkout counter, and the prices were extortionate. To meet these demands, Britain had to drain its veins. In a secret mission, codenamed Operation Fish, the British government loaded its entire national wealth onto battleships and fast ocean liners. We are not talking about numbers on a screen. We are talking about physical, heavy, cold gold. Billions of dollars in bullion and negotiable securities, the savings of 3 generations of British citizens, were packed into crates and shipped across the U-boat-infested Atlantic to vaults in Canada and the Federal Reserve in New York. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history, and it was a gamble of epic proportions. If a single U-boat had intercepted the wrong convoy, the financial backbone of the empire would have sunk to the bottom of the ocean. But the ships arrived. The gold was offloaded. It was transferred directly into the accounts of American corporations like Boeing, Lockheed, and Ford. And by December 1940, the money was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington sat with their heads in their hands. They had contracts on their desks for vital equipment, planes to stop the bombing, rifles to arm the Home Guard. But the Treasury in London had sent the order: stop signing. The checking account is overdrawn. Churchill hoped that once the cash was gone, Roosevelt would act out of sentiment. He hoped for a gift. What he got instead was an audit. The man standing at the gate of American aid was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the U.S. Treasury Secretary. Morgenthau was a staunch anti-fascist, and he hated Hitler. But his primary loyalty was to the American ledger. When the British claimed they were broke, Morgenthau didn't take their word for it. He demanded proof. In a move that stunned the British aristocratic negotiators, Morgenthau demanded a complete forensic audit of the British Empire. He wanted a list of every asset owned by the British government and, crucially, every stock, bond, and factory owned by private British citizens anywhere in the world. The British negotiator, Sir Frederick Phillips, was humiliated. He argued that selling off long-term investments in the middle of a panic would be financial suicide. He pleaded that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country destitute after the war, unable to import food to feed its people. Morgenthau's response was chillingly bureaucratic. He essentially told them, if you still have assets in America, why should the American farmer in Iowa pay for your war? The United States was not preparing to subsidize the British Empire. They were preparing to buy it out at a fire sale price, and they needed a sacrificial lamb to prove it. The target was the American Viscose Corporation. To the average person, the name meant little, but to the Treasury, it was the crown jewel of British overseas investment. Owned by the British giant Courtaulds, it was the largest manufacturer of artificial silk in America. It was a money-printing machine worth over $100 million. Morgenthau held a gun to the head of the British team. The Lend-Lease Act was stalled in Congress. Isolationist senators were screaming that the British were lying about their poverty. Morgenthau issued an ultimatum: sell American viscose immediately, or Lend-Lease dies in committee. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, the British government seized the company from its owners and handed it over to Wall Street bankers. Knowing the seller was desperate, the bankers circled like sharks. They drove the price into the ground. When the gavel fell, American Viscose was sold for just $54 million, barely half its actual value. The British government had to reimburse the owners in pounds, increasing their own debt, while the dollars went straight to the U.S. Treasury. It wasn't a transaction, it was a foreclosure. Winston Churchill later privately referred to it as a sheriff's sale. But if American Viscose was the financial cost of survival, the destroyers for bases deal was the geopolitical cost. While the accountants were stripping assets, the admirals were stripping territory. Churchill was desperate for ships to hunt U-boats. He begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers, ships that had been sitting in mothballs for 20 years, rusting and barely seaworthy. Roosevelt agreed, but the price tag for this scrap metal was the strategic map of the Western Hemisphere. In exchange for 50 old ships, the United States demanded 99-year rent-free leases on a string of British naval and air bases, from Newfoundland in the north to the Caribbean in the south. Pause and consider the asymmetry of that trade. Britain got 50 obsolete ships. The United States got a century of military dominance over the Atlantic. They effectively evicted Britain from its own backyard. It was the moment the United States physically took over the role of guardian of the seas. The Union Jack came down, the stars and stripes went up, and the geopolitical center of gravity shifted 3,000 miles west. Yet the most damaging transfer was invisible. As the war dragged on, the U.S. imposed strict conditions. Britain was forbidden from using Lend-Lease materials to make exports. Britain had to convert every factory to war production. They stopped making cars, radios, and textiles. They abandoned their customers in Latin America and Asia. And nature abhors a vacuum. As British firms withdrew, American firms stepped in. By the time the war ended, the transfer was absolute. Britain had won the war militarily, but it had lost its market share permanently. The workshop of the world had been shuttered. When British factories finally tried to reopen in 1945, they found their seat at the table had been taken by General Motors and General Electric. But the Americans weren't done. They knew the empire would try to rebuild. So, they planted a poison pill deep inside the Lend-Lease agreement. A clause designed to make sure the British economy could never rise again. They called it Article 7. Was a paragraph of dense diplomatic legalese buried deep within the Lend-Lease Master Agreement. To the casual reader, it sounded benign, a commitment to eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce. It sounded like freedom, but the British negotiators knew exactly what those words meant. They were a death warrant for the empire as an economic unit. For decades, the British Empire had operated as a closed garden protected by a system called imperial preference. It was a series of tariff walls that made British goods cheaper in India, Australia, and Canada than goods from anywhere else. It was the only shield keeping British industry alive against American competition. Article 7 demanded that Britain tear down that shield. The Americans knew that in a fair fight, British industry, battered by bombing and exhausted by war, could not compete with the modern efficient juggernaut of the U.S. economy. By forcing Britain to sign Article 7, the United States was effectively using the war debt to batter down the gates of the British colonies. They were ensuring that after the war an Indian merchant in Bombay would buy an American tractor, not a British one. The British fought it. They delayed. But with the Nazis in control of Europe and the treasury empty, they had no leverage. They signed. Then came the peace, and with it, the trap snapped shut. In August 1945, the guns fell silent. Japan surrendered. And 7 days later, President Truman abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. The cutoff was brutal and absolute. American Liberty ships, loaded with wheat and tools bound for Liverpool, were ordered to turn around in the middle of the Atlantic and sail back to New York. The lifeline was severed. Britain was facing what the economist John Maynard Keynes called a financial Dunkirk. The country was importing half its food, paid for with American aid. Without those dollars, Britain faced starvation and industrial collapse within months. Keynes, the greatest economic mind of the 20th century, traveled to Washington one last time. He was old, suffering from heart disease, and exhausted. He went not to negotiate a treaty, but to beg for a lifeline. Keynes believed he had a moral case. He argued that Britain had fought alone for 2 years, bankrupting itself to hold the line for civilization. He asked for a grant, a gift of $6 billion, as retroactive payment for the blood and treasure Britain had sacrificed. The Americans looked at him with cold, banker's eyes. The war was over. The sentimentality was gone. They offered no grant. Instead, they offered a commercial loan. $3.75 billion, at 2% interest. It was barely enough to keep the lights on. But the loan came with a condition that was far more dangerous than the interest rate. It was a clause that would go down in history as one of the most destructive financial weapons ever deployed against an ally: sterling convertibility. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. To understand why this was a death trap, you have to understand how Britain was surviving. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies to keep their money in pounds, and forbade them from exchanging those pounds for dollars. It was a closed loop that protected the currency from collapsing. The U.S. demanded the loop be broken. They insisted that anyone holding pounds from Egypt to Australia must be allowed to swap them for U.S. dollars immediately. Keynes was horrified. He knew exactly what would happen. He knew that the world was starving for American goods, and the only currency that could buy them was the dollar. He warned that if they opened the window, there would be a run on the bank. Every nation holding pounds would dump them immediately to get their hands on hard American cash. But the Americans were immovable. Their goal was to make the dollar the undisputed king of global commerce. To do that, the pound had to be dethroned. They gave Britain an ultimatum: accept the convertibility clause or face starvation. Keynes advised Parliament to accept. He had no choice. He died just a few months later, his heart finally giving out under the stress of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The loan agreement was signed in July 1946. The clock began to tick. Britain had exactly 1 year to prepare for the window to open. They tried to reassure the markets. They tried to project confidence that they were walking toward a cliff edge that the United States had built for them. And on July 15, 1947, the deadline arrived. Britain honored its word. They made the pound convertible. The result was a massacre. It wasn't just a run on the bank. It was a run on the British nation. On July 15, 1947, as mandated by the American Treaty, the Bank of England opened its doors and allowed holders of sterling to exchange them for dollars. The response was immediate and catastrophic. It was like watching a dam burst. Countries that had been stockpiling pounds for years, Argentina, Belgium, Canada, didn't want British debt. They wanted American purchasing power. They rushed to dump their sterling holdings. In the first week, Britain lost millions. By the second week, it was a torrent. The American loan, which was supposed to fund Britain's reconstruction for 5 years, was evaporating in days. Inside the British Treasury, Chancellor Hugh Dalton watched the reserves bleed out on the ticker tape. He saw the lifeblood of the economy flowing west across the Atlantic. The government begged Washington for permission to close the window, to stop the hemorrhage. The Americans, watching coolly from the sidelines, eventually nodded. On August 20, 1947, just 5 weeks after it began, Britain slammed the convertibility window shut. But the damage was done. In 35 days, Britain had burned through a staggering portion of its dollar reserves for absolutely nothing. The experiment was a humiliating failure. Britain had tried to play by American rules, and it had been crushed. The financial Dunkirk that Keynes had feared had arrived, and as if to mock the fallen empire, nature itself turned against the island. The winter of 1947 went down as the cruelest in living memory. Blizzards buried the country in snow. Coal stockpiles froze into solid blocks of ice at the depots. Power stations shut down. Factories fell silent. The British people, who had endured the German Blitz with stoic cheerfulness, were now shivering in unheated homes, lighting candles because the electricity was cut. They were eating rations that were stricter than anything imposed during the war. Even bread, which had never been rationed while U-boats circled the island, was now rationed in peacetime. This was the reality of the special relationship. The victor was starving, freezing, and broke, while the ally they had fought to protect was enjoying the greatest economic boom in human history. It was in this frozen, dark atmosphere that the final geopolitical shoe dropped. The bankruptcy finally moved from the ledger to the map. For a century, Great Britain had been the policeman of the world. Specifically, it had been the guardian of the Mediterranean, bankrolling the governments of Greece and Turkey to keep the Soviets out. But money is power, and Britain had neither left. In February 1947, the British Embassy in Washington sent a secret telegram to the U.S. State Department. It is one of the most important documents of the 20th century, though few have read it. It was a letter of resignation. The message was blunt. We can no longer afford to be a superpower. We are pulling out of Greece and Turkey. If you want to stop the communists, you have to do it. This was the moment the baton officially dropped. The United States picked it up immediately. Within weeks, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, declaring that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation. America stepped into the vacuum Britain had left. They took over the bases, the influence, and the role of global hegemon. The transition was complete. Britain had not been conquered by an enemy, it had been displaced by a friend. The final act of this tragedy came 2 years later, in 1949. With the economy still stagnant and the reserves hollowed out, the British government was forced to face the truth. The pound sterling could not look the dollar in the eye. On September 18, 1949, the government announced the devaluation of the pound. Before the war, a pound bought $4.86. After the war, it was pegged at $4.03. Overnight, it was slashed to $2.80. In a single stroke, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world. Their savings, their pensions, their international purchasing power slashed. It was the formal admission that the British economy was no longer a peer to the American economy. It was a subordinate. The empire didn't end with a bang or a revolution. It ended with a foreclosure notice, a frozen winter, and a currency devaluation. The British people had paid the ultimate price for victory. They had spent their empire to buy the world's freedom, only to find that the bill collector was waiting at the door, and the bill collector spoke English. The bill for freedom was long, and it carried interest. The Anglo-American Loan of 1946 was not a gift. It was a commercial mortgage on the future of the British people. Through the economic boom of the 1950s, the gloom of the 70s, the Thatcher Revolution, and the Blair years, the payments continued. On December 29, 2006, 61 years after the guns fell silent, the British Treasury electronically transferred the final installment of $83 million to the United States. Only then, 6 decades later, did Britain finally own its survival. So when we look back at the ashes of World War II, we must ask the uncomfortable question: who really won? Germany was defeated, destroyed, and then rebuilt. Britain was victorious, celebrated, and then bankrupted. But the United States emerged holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Economic had doubled in size. The dollar had replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. And the Royal Navy had been replaced by U.S. carrier groups as the guardians of the high seas. The United States did not conquer the British Empire with armies. They bought it. They acquired the assets, the bases, the markets, and the geopolitical influence in a distressed asset sale managed by the U.S. Treasury. This is the cold reality of power. There are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. When an ally is on their knees, that is not the moment for charity. That is the moment for acquisition. Winston Churchill is rightly remembered as the man who saved Western civilization. But in doing so, he was forced to sign the deed of sale. He traded the empire for the island. It was a deal that had to be made. There was no other choice against Hitler. But we must never forget the price. The special relationship was not a marriage of equals. It was a merger and acquisition. The lesson for the modern world is clear. Empires are no longer taken by cavalry or cannon fire. They are taken by debt, by currency, and by the ruthless arithmetic of the balance sheet. Britain paid the price. The question now is, who is next? Subscribe now to stay ahead of the times, because when history is written, you'll want to be among the few who recognized what was coming early. Thank you for watching and being part of the journey.